She left me with a lot of gathered extra skin after my first surgery. And thankfully, I had unclear margins for those calcifications and they had to do another surgery. So I said, please, this time, leave me flat. Nothing, no extra, please, just flat. Because I want to get a tattoo and I want to have a flat palette for my tattoo. And again, she ignored my wishes pretty explicitly this time and left me with a lump of extra skin that she said she wanted to fashion into a nipple. And in the flat community, we call this flat denial. It's very common. My name is Kathleen. I live in Northwest rural Oregon, about halfway between Portland and the coast in the foothills of the Coastal Range in Oregon wine country. And my diagnosis was lobular breast cancer, invasive lobular, and DCIS, which stands for ductal carcinoma in situ. I was diagnosed with DCIS in 2021 and also with lobular breast cancer in 2022. It's been about 10 years since I was first suspected to have something in my left breast. I had a big lump in my right breast that turned out to be totally benign. It was just a pocket of cysts. And that was just after my marriage. And I think it probably came from, we got a bunch of sheep. We had a little hobby farm and ranch, and we were wrangling sheep on a regular basis. And I think I was probably bumped by one of the sheep pretty hard while wrangling them to cut their toenails. And ended up with this huge cyst, pocket of cysts in my right breast, which I went in for because it felt like a soft lump. And because of that, they detected a shadow in my left breast, a very, very small little shadow that they followed every 6 months for about 6 years after that until COVID came. And right before COVID came, they said it was looking good and I didn't need more surveillance. And then less than a year later, I started having bloody nipple discharge. That was my main symptom. My breast didn't look or feel any different, but I was having this discharge, and that is a symptom of breast cancer. And so I started having ultrasounds again, didn't see anything, had MRIs. The MRIs saw calcifications, which is kind of a result of that precancer DCIS, but nothing too concerning at first. And the biopsies that they took couldn't find anything at all physical to diagnose me with. So I went a whole year with that bloody nipple discharge symptom before getting my mastectomy. And like I said, after my mastectomy in pathology, when looked at under a microscope, my tissue revealed itself to have lobular breast cancer, which is very different than ductal breast cancer. Lobular is just 15% of the breast cancer population, and it grows like a spider web. The cells don't stick together in a lump like they do in a normal cancer tumor. They spread out like a spider web in single file cell lines. And because of that, they're really hard to detect in imaging. And I've learned a ton about lobular breast cancer since then, since I'm a volunteer with the Lobular Breast Cancer Alliance. But was really surprised to hear that I had cancer. I wasn't ever told you have cancer, like a lot of my friends in the breast cancer community were. I knew that I had precancer and that it wasn't terribly threatening. But coming out of surgery, I was told that I did have cancer, something I didn't know. The reason I had my first mastectomy was because the DCIS was growing a lot. And my integrative oncologist, Dr. Lemon, told me that that was because I had high growth factors. I had a tendency to respond to injury with a lot of growth. And that explains why I had the cysts in my right breast. I had an injury in my right breast and a lot of growth of cysts. Well, in my left breast, I had a little tiny seed of cancer, and the DCIS was precancer in the ducts. And that spread and did grow pretty significantly after my first set of biopsies. That was her explanation. I don't know that all oncologists would agree with that, but that's my understanding as to why the DCIS got so diffuse. And when DCIS reaches a larger level of concern, when it's in a later grade, which mine did, then all oncologists are going to recommend a mastectomy, even though it is still precancer. So I got my first mastectomy going in, not feeling too heavy about it. It was heavy because I was losing my breast, but I didn't feel that I was in danger of having invasive cancer until afterwards. I was pretty stunned to find out that I did have invasive cancer. I didn't think that was even possible I have gone through, at that point, I had gone through 4 or 5 MRIs, a full body PET scan, multiple ultrasounds, and I didn't think that cancer could hide that well. And so I was pretty stunned. And my first instinct was to look at my husband and say, I want the other breast off too. If they couldn't see this cancer in my one very, very dense breast, who's to say it's not also in the other one and I can't see it there? So at that point, I was planning on living the rest of my life with one breast. And I pretty quickly decided that I wanted to sacrifice the other breast so that just for my peace of mind, so that I could know that it wasn't coming back or already living in there too. And my husband totally agreed with me. He was like, "Oh, I'm so glad you said that because that's my instinct too." The amount of lobular cancer was so small that they found in there. It was just 2 millimeters, barely detectable. It was not super important that I go on a treatment regime. I didn't need to take tamoxifen or aromatase inhibitor like letrozole, like a lot of other breast cancer survivors. My main cancer was that precancer still. And for DCIS survivors, you don't generally get put on any chemo because it is, like I said, it's not a very threatening type of cancer or precancer. So my real treatment was just the surgery. I did have the option. I spoke to many oncologists wanting to learn about lobular breast cancer because I had that huge long time, 8 years to learn about breast cancer. And I'd never learned once about this type of breast cancer. And it's actually larger in quantity. The number of women that get it is larger than the number of women that get ovarian cancer. So there's a lot of women that have lobular breast cancer, but you just don't hear about it or read about it. And so I wanted to talk to specialists. And I went down to a research facility in San Francisco to talk to a surgeon who is a researcher that specializes in lobular. And she did say that I could take aromatase inhibitors, but I was just entering the menopause transition. And so I wanted to wait and let my body go through menopause naturally. Now, in the meantime, my mom, who was also diagnosed with breast cancer around the same time that I was in 2021, she was 90 years old and she wanted to just die naturally of the tumor that was inhibiting her airway in her lung. I chose not to have reconstruction. I knew right away that it wasn't for me. I've had a couple of different autoimmune disorders, Epstein-Barr and chronic fatigue syndrome. And so I knew that I would be very sensitive to a foreign body inside me. So there's no question at all for me. I didn't want an implant. I did actually have a really hard time. Probably the hardest struggle in my breast cancer story was the fact that I had a hard time being listened to by my first plastic surgeon. These days you get a breast surgeon and a plastic surgeon. The breast surgeon takes out all the cancer or the breast tissue, and then the plastic surgeon comes in to make a really beautiful outcome with what's left, with the skin that's left. And generally they like to save skin. So it's really hard to get through to a plastic surgeon and say, I do not want to save my skin. I did go ahead and agree to having a Goldilocks mastectomy, which is a mastectomy that uses just your skin that's just in the area of your breast to build a small mound. Mine is more like a crescent moon. I have a Goldilocks on my right side on my second mastectomy. And I did agree to do that on my left side where my cancer was, but they weren't able to save enough skin. I had let my DCIS go long enough to where it had kind of infected my skin and there were calcifications in my skin, and they don't like to leave those. And I knew that was a possibility. So I told my surgeon ahead of time, if you can't save my skin and give me a Goldilocks, I want to be smooth. I want to be flat. And she kind of ignored that and didn't write it down, didn't remember it. I don't know, but she left me with a lot of gathered extra skin after my first surgery. And thankfully I had unclear margins for those calcifications and they had to do another surgery. So I said, please, this time, leave me flat. Nothing, no extra, please, just flat. Because I want to get a tattoo and I want to have a flat palette for my tattoo. And again, she ignored my wishes pretty explicitly this time and left me with a lump of extra skin that she said she wanted to fashion into a nipple. And in the flat community, we call this flat denial. It's very common. There are many, many women out there that have asked to be flat and smooth after mastectomy and been left with extra baggy skin. And unfortunately, this is something you have to go back again and correct in a third surgery. Thankfully, I was getting my other breast removed already. So I just really worked hard to find the right plastic surgeon who could really hear me and affirm that they would make me flat on the left side as they were building that very small little crescent shaped breast on the right side. And that's what I got. I'm asymmetric now. And I call myself kind of a learning example for women that when they want to see what flat looks like, I pull my shirt up and show them what flat looks like on this side with my beautiful wild rose tattoo covering up my scars. And I show them what the Goldilocks looks like on my right side. And I love Goldilocks. I think it's a wonderful option for women who don't want to have the lengthy implant surgeries and go in every 10 years for a replacement for their implant. It's really quick and easy. And it looks like a little breast. It really does look like an A cup. And in the cases when you have enough skin to make a little bit of a mound. So I'm a big advocate for the Goldilocks closure. When you go flat after mastectomy, you don't have a lot of surveillance options because there's not anything to put in the MRI machine. My oncologist has agreed to let me do ultrasounds every other year and then MRI every other year because it's thought with the Goldilocks mastectomy that there could still be a few breast cells in there. There's a bit of a mound, so it's possible that there could still be breast mounds, and that's the justification that you need for your insurance to cover an MRI. So I did actually just have an MRI in November, and it didn't show any concerns on that side where I have the bulk, but it did light up with a cyst that showed up in my axillary area. And so I did have an excisional biopsy. So there are ongoing, trips in for imaging and even biopsies after breast cancer, just to be sure. I also do tumor markers, which are kind of an extinct way of surveilling breast cancer survivors. They used to do them a lot more. And because my mom's tumor markers were really high just before her death, I was really caught by that as a possible way to have known that my mom was getting metastatic breast cancer. And so I convinced my oncologist to do those markers. There's just a blood test. It's really easy and cheap to do it. It is kind of there can be confounding factors when you do tumor markers. So a lot of oncologists don't like to do them. Like COVID is a confounding factor. Anything that causes a lot of inflammation in the body can make those tumor markers rise and make it look like you have cancer when maybe you don't. So that's why they've decided not to do it as often anymore. The biggest challenge for me was right after my first mastectomy. I was finding a few folks online on Instagram that had gone flat, and I was taking great encouragement from the fact that I wasn't alone in that context. But I really needed people in person that could understand what I was going through with my body changes. And my local breast cancer support group didn't have any flatties in it. So I was pretty alone for a few months until I found the flat community online and learned their rhythms and patterns, and especially Stand Tall AFC. That's the organization that I now volunteer a lot for. I knew that I needed to go flat. The first realization I had was just looking down and going, oh, this is somewhat familiar. And then working through the fact that I was remembering my child self, my child's body, these little mounds that I have, tiny bit of cleavage that I have, reminds me of the way that I was when I was a child, when I was innocent and free and I could run and not be self-conscious. So there's a lot of freedom with going flat. There's also just that sense of community, of shared experience of having your body changed. A lot of us have experienced flat denial, and so learning that together and learning that I'm not alone in that was really important too. So I found my little niche of the breast cancer community that made me feel like things weren't so bad. I didn't need to be ashamed, and I could celebrate the good sides, the upsides. A lot of us who have breast cancer had extremely dense and fibrous, heavy breasts. And being pretty thin in my stature, it was awkward for me to have such large breasts. I grew up a cup size every year or so throughout my 30s, and when I was going through perimenopause, my breasts would just get bigger and bigger. I was self-conscious about them. They were heavy. It was hard to do things like running or exercising without being self-conscious. And so I have a lot of gratitude now for my new body. I've experienced what it was like to have big, beautiful breasts, and had a good 50 years of my life to appreciate that. And I look forward to another 50 years of my life appreciating not having to deal with breasts in the social way and in the physical way. I put a lot of hope in exercise oncology these days. As a nutritionist, I originally put a lot of hope in my nutrition. I actually became a nutritionist because of my 2 cancer scares in my early 40s. I had uterine polyps as well that had to be removed. And I became a nutritionist thinking that what I put in my mouth was the main thing that would affect whether or not I got cancer in the end. And as a nutritionist now, I don't believe that is true. I think that it is a definite factor, it's a contributing factor, but exercise shows way more proof in the good clinical studies that we've seen recently, and not drinking alcohol actually does too. But exercise is an extreme treatment for breast cancer, and I'm getting behind that now. I have what I think might become a nonprofit, but a little pilot project here locally that I'm calling Walk Away from Breast Cancer. And I've partnered with a bunch of other survivors of all types, shapes, and sizes. And our main unifying factor is that we're not natural athletes, or we're not naturally inclined to go out and exercise every day. And so we keep each other accountable. The most important thing to know is that you need other people to reflect back the beauty of who you are after breast cancer. It's a very physical disease. Other cancers are hidden inside the body and not so external, not so visible. And so I think once you get through all the trauma of the chemo and radiation, which is one thing for sure to get through and recover from, the external effects of your body not feeling the same, whether you have implants or not, you don't feel the same about your breasts and your chest area. And I think we really need other women to reflect back that you are still beautiful, you're still feminine, your body is strong, it's healthy, and it might feel painful. There might be some sorrow that lasts the rest of your life. For me, there isn't too much sorrow anymore, and I mainly attribute that to my community of flatties.